Hello to all of you. I can't see all your screens, but I see at least a few familiar faces. So hi, Scott. And who else did I see over there? And I see hi, Susan, and the Schultzes are here as well. And for those who I haven't yet met, I look forward to meeting you now and hearing maybe some questions afterwards. And in our next session, which I believe is on the 17th of April, if I'm not mistaken, during Holydays. So I'm looking at how Israel, in the short 77 years of our history, has created sacred space and sacred time and national holidays, pretty much with the epicenter in our capital city, Jerusalem, and specifically one geographic area, and that is Mount Herzl. I begin with the picture, which talks, I think, a little bit about a tension in our tradition, and that is a tension between Jewish tradition, which for 1900 years of exile and dispersion longed for a return to the land of Israel, and then in the birth of the late 19th century of the political movement of Zionism as represented by the Israeli flag, and we the people becoming sovereign. When we the people became sovereign, in many ways it was a revolt against traditional Judaism that prayed and hoped and longed for a return, that God would see us as the generation that would be suitable to return to the land of Israel from which we've been exiled. But we, the people, becoming sovereign as a national movement in the late 19th century, founded a society that ultimately became a state in May of 1948. And in the early years after Israeli independence, what we'll look at today and next week is trying to figure out how Israel created a mechanism to not just socialize Israelis, but to tell the story by having sacred geography, Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, and creating sacred time, a 10-day period equivalent to the Yamim HaNoraim, the high holidays from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, of three major national holidays of memory and celebration. So today we'll talk about the geography, and the second session will talk a lot more about the time. Ribonut versus Rabbanut. The word sounds very similar. They're spelled almost identically in Hebrew. You can see on the right-hand side for the Hebrew readers. But I want to kind of go through a very, very quick, less than a minute actually, story of our people. That, of course, is the Knesset, the symbol of sovereign modern state of Israel in Jerusalem, not too far from where Gila is sitting, a little bit further from where I'm sitting in the town of Modi'in. But just try to reflect on what happened in Jerusalem thousands of years ago, or how Jerusalem eventually, I should say, became part of our story, right? Where does our story begin? I always ask that question. And because we're just around the corner from Pesach, and another advertisement, as Gila already said, if you haven't started your Pesach cleaning, you should. But just around the corner from Pesach, we are at the point where God delivers us out of slavery to be a holy people, and takes us into the land of Israel. We then, after hundreds of years of being led by charismatic leaders, judges, ask for a king. We get King Saul, later on King David, later on King Solomon, who then builds a temple in Jerusalem, where his father David had bought the land. That sacred temple is administered by priests already chosen in the desert, born into a priestly caste. The temple lasted, it was destroyed. Second temple was built, that too was destroyed. And lo and behold, about 2,000 years ago, when the second temple was destroyed, we had a crisis. Not the first and not the last, but this crisis led to a new form of Judaism evolving. And that was a Judaism in absence of a temple, where synagogues replaced the temple, where rabbis, teachers of the law, replaced people born into the priestly caste, and where prayers replaced the three-time daily animal sacrifice in the temple. And that is a term that we use to describe Rabbanut, the leadership of rabbis, interpreters of the law, pretty much guiding us for 2,000 years since the destruction of the Second Temple and our exile. But as I mentioned a minute ago, when Zionism was born in the late 19th century, essentially creating modern Jewish political sovereignty, the concept that we use today to describe sovereignty in modern Hebrew is called Ribonut. And you'll hear the easy connection, or the close connection, I should say, between the word Rabbanut, being led by the rabbis, right, the people who were the teachers of the law for 1900 years, versus Ribonut, kind of like your foundational document in America, we the people, right? The Jewish people are sovereign. And there's a tension between, I've circled in red here, Ribonut, the rabbinic interpretation of God's law and God's ruling, and Ribonut, the sovereignty of the people. And where does that come into a clash? Think about it. When we pray in synagogue, and we, in many references, but the easiest one to remember is in the Aleinu, and we say, Aleinu l'shabeach, we give thanks, l'adon hakol, to the master of the universe, God of everything. And in a sense, what national Jewish sovereignty does is, at least in certain sectors, particularly ultra-Orthodox, is it comes in a direct conflict. Maybe we'll have time for that, the questions later on today or next week, but there is a tension between 1900 years of Jewish leadership interpreting God's law and word through the rabbis and modern political sovereignty. That's point one in terms of introduction. Point two in terms of introduction is that we are a people endowed with an incredible sense of memory. And what happened to us, the chapters of our story, including in our lifetime, including 16 months ago on October 7th, are key chapters that help us understand how we got to where we are, who we are, and also where we want to get to. And of course, perhaps the most important or the most quoted sense of how deeply rooted memory is in our DNA is from the Bible. In the book of Psalms, verse 137, we say it under the chuppah, under the wedding canopy, and the Hebrew is different than the English. Those of you who read Hebrew, you see in the bottom, Al Narot Bavel, on the rivers of Babylon, there we sat, Gam Bachinu, and we cried as we remembered, over here in Hebrew, whereas in English, it's as we thought. Why? Whoever translated the Bible in this particular version that Mike chose to use doesn't understand the difference between remembering and thinking. It's a very big, big difference. And we continued, Im eshkechech Yerushalayim, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, if I cease to think of you, or as in the Hebrew on the bottom, again, it's the Hebrew word for remember, eskareni. So we are a people endowed with this incredible sense of memory. And so when we create a modern space in a state, as we do in 1948 when we declare independence, we have to figure out how we take that memory of not just 1900 years, but the contemporary story as well, and how we integrate that into who we are. One of my favorite sources in Jewish education, I reference it always at the Pesach Seder, is Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. He used to teach, I think, at the University of Washington. He passed away already a number of years ago. In his very famous book, Zachor Remembrance, he says that Judaism, read the yellow, tries to fuse the past and present. And memory isn't merely recollection, but reactualization. And he continues, remember the Seder. Every generation is obligated to see oneself as if one personally went out of Egypt. This is the bread of affliction. What do we do in Judaism? We actually take that memory and we reactualize it. We have to figure out a way to teach our children and our grandchildren how to actually understand through our memory that is passed on through through thousands and thousands of years of what happened in Egypt and how God took us out and we came into the land of Israel. But in the modern state of Israel, we reactualize that memory physically in space at Mount Herzl with the three main components. One is the tomb of the great leaders and the visionary of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl. Two is the military cemetery. And three is Yad Vashem, the memorial to the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. So through text and through ritual, and Yerushalmi suggests perhaps the most coherent or the clearest example of that is the Passover Seder ritual. We reactualize memory. We create sacred space to tell a story that will allow us to reactualize memory, and that is in Jerusalem at Mount Herzl. Another favorite source of mine, particularly when I guide in Eastern and Central Europe, and a few of you have been there with me, is James Young, who in his very powerful book, The Texture of Memory on the right-hand side, says that through this attention of our people, of memory memorialization, we might also remind ourselves that public memory is structured. Understanding of events depends on memory construction and their consequences and the kinds of historical understanding generated by monuments. So, if we want to tell a story, we choose what monuments we're going to erect in order to allow us to tell that story. So we might remember some of you might remember where you were in 1967 Six-Day War, but the young 18-year-olds going into the Israel Defense Forces today, that's ancient history. There's not much difference between 1967 and 1941 and the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era. So one, as I said, is this tension between rabbinic rule and authority, rabbanut, and ribonut, modern political sovereignty. And the second context is the sense of memory and reactualization of memory through space and through time next week. Now, the epicenter is this mountain on the western edge of Jerusalem. I know you're mostly American, so that's meaningless to you. 834 meters above sea level is about 2,500 feet above sea level. But this mountain, Mount Herzl, is the epicenter of national observance of the three holidays, which I'll talk about on the 17th. Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day for the Holocaust and heroism. Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day for soldiers, and Independence Day. Memorial Day for fallen soldiers begins at the Western Wall, but ends and then transitions into this very powerful moment of Independence Day. More of that in next week's session, as I mentioned before. What are the three physical components? One is the final resting place of Dr. Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, who began that process of transitioning our source of authority from Rabbanut to Ribonut. Next to him is the area called the great leaders of the nation, many, but not all, of our past presidents, prime ministers, speakers of the parliament. As we continue down the hill, and you'll see this in a moment when I begin with the visual image of Mount Herzl, is the area of the military cemetery. You can spend days in the cemetery telling the story of all of the wars and all of the battles and understanding the rich fabric, diversity of the human capital that is the state of Israel. Thousands and thousands of men and women as well, of all ages, from all different parts of the world. And in recent years, you'll see in a few minutes, all sorts of new additional memorials have been added. Why? You'll see, because they continue to tell the story of the evolution of our people returning to our homeland. And of course, Yad Vashem, the memorial to the 6 million victims of the Shoah. So, is there a connection? Not just in the geography, but in the way the story is told. If we are a people of memory, and the word memory, or some form of it, appears 169 times in the Torah as a verb, keeping in mind, suggesting that that's one of the ways that we are Jewish. Our Jewish identity is expressed through our memory. What particular narrative does this geography of Mount Herzl, or Har HaZikaron in Hebrew, actually reflect? You might have heard the term Mishoah L'Tkuma, or Mishoah L'Gvura, from Holocaust to heroism, but more Holocaust to rebirth. Is there a link between the Shoah, the worst crime ever perpetrated against our people, and the rebirth of the state of Israel? Let's go back to the sources. At this time, future prime minister in 1962, at this time he's the finance minister, Levi Eshkol, and he says the following: the very struggle against the Nazi adversary and the victory which followed in the War of Independence laid the foundation for the revival of our national independence. Seen in this light, the Jewish fight against the Nazis in the War of Independence were in fact a single protracted battle. The geographical proximity between Yad Vashem and Mount Herzl thus expresses far more than mere physical closeness. Now, that might have been true in 1962, but if you ask young Israelis today, is there a link between the Holocaust and the rebirth? Mishoah L'Tkuma? Many Israelis would say, yours truly included, well, yes. There was more world sympathy toward the Jewish people after 1945 that allowed them to vote in the United Nations to create a Jewish state. But to suggest that the state of Israel is here because of the Holocaust would be, I believe, historically wrong. The state of Israel is here despite the Holocaust, because the state of Israel was created in those 70 years of Zionist movement and pre-Zionist movement from 1880 until 1948. But the founding fathers wanted to tell a story. And the story that they told is different than the story that we tell today. We told pre-October 7th, I believe, and will be different afterwards. What about your country? Your country has a capital. It's called Washington, D.C. And like the Roman Pantheon, pictured here in Rome, which was designed in order to memorialize the virtues, events, and persons most representative of the ideals of the people, an attempt to raise a particular version of the nation's founding to a level of myth. So you create space and you put memorials in Washington. You recognize some of these images, I assume. The Jefferson Memorial. I'm Canadian, so if I get that wrong, I think that's Lincoln. He's the guy in the penny. The Arlington Military Cemetery, the Vietnam Memorial. In Washington, you create memorials that tell a story about who you are as a people. And so too did we in Jerusalem. Now, Mount Herzl, don't read all the text. Mount Herzl is named after Theodor Herzl, who famously wrote a book in 1896 calling for the creation of a Jewish state, had the first Zionist Congress in 1897, and he says maybe a little bit. In vain we are loyal patriots, our loyalty in some place running to extremes. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land in science and art. But the distinctive nationality of Jews neither can, will, nor will be destroyed. This has been demonstrated during 2,000 years of appalling suffering. Herzl essentially says, we want to contribute to the local society and preserve our tradition, but we're still seen as outsiders. Therefore, we must create our own state. And he famously says, if you will, it is no dream. And at the end of the first Zionist Congress in 1897, he writes in his diary, in Basel, where the Zionist Congress took place, I founded the Jewish state. If I were to say this out loud today, people would laugh. But perhaps in another 5 years, certainly in another 50, everyone will recognize it. He wasn't far off, because that was 1897. And in November of 1947, the UN did indeed recommend creating a Jewish state, which came into birth on Hey B'Iyar, the 5th of Iyar, or May 14th, 1948. And he dies tragically too young, a man of 44 years of age. And before he dies, a year before in his will, he writes, I wish to be buried in a metal coffin next to my father, and to remain there until the Jewish people will transfer my remains to the land of Israel. The coffins of my father, etc., will have died, will also be transferred there. He did die in Vienna in 1904, and in 1949, as one of the first acts of the first Knesset, the first parliament in Israel, the remains of Theodor Herzl were reinterred atop the mountain that was posthumously named after Dr. Herzl. There is the funeral procession. I don't know if you've had David Matlow on any of your sessions, but a friend of mine in Toronto, he is the world's largest collector of Theodor Herzl paraphernalia. A friend of mine who sent me some of these pictures, postcard of the funeral of Theodor Herzl back in 1904 in Vienna, images of the tomb of Theodor Herzl, and of course the ceremony, the honor guard standing right next to the tomb of Theodor Herzl. When I was preparing this, I found this ancient TV, and I downloaded this video from the Israeli State Archives, which is an amazing story of the visual story of Theodor Herzl's remains being brought back to the land of Israel from Vienna. There's a war still going on. We don't have peace with our neighbors. We're signing armistices with our neighbors, but there was a lot of pomp and circumstance that was dedicated to exhuming the body of Theodor Herzl 45 years later, bringing him to then the Lod airport. People always ask, why wasn't it called Ben Gurion Airport? Well, Ben Gurion was prime minister at the time. He only died in 1973, so the name of the airport was changed to Ben Gurion Airport. But there they are, the honor guard soldiers. He's then going to go to the beach in Tel Aviv, Theodor Herzl, where he will sit. There he is, thousands and thousands of Israelis. Keep in mind, there may be 1 million people in the entire country at the time. He's brought to the beach in Tel Aviv in front of what was the makeshift parliament theater along the beach. The VIPs are being led first to pay their honor and homage to Theodor Herzl, which, by the way, is unusual because we don't usually pay homage in Jewish tradition. Lots and lots of Tel Avivians, you can see after the VIPs, everyone else starts to come. And then, after seeing the sunset on the beach in Tel Aviv, his body is then brought up to Jerusalem, where he's brought and put and laid in state in front of the Zionist institutions, the home of the World Zionist Organization. You should vote, by the way, if you haven't already, for the World Zionist Organization, and and the JNF. He's laid in state there. And then his body is brought to the western edge of Jerusalem, where this empty hilltop, he is laid on this mountain that, as I said, eventually becomes Mount Herzl in honor of the founder of political Zionism. And an amazing thing happens, you'll see now, where representatives of communities from all over the country bring little sacks of soil. You can see, there it is from Kibbutz Yakum, there it is from Kibbutz Hulda, where they bring little sacks of dirt from their own community, and they bury him with the sacks of dirt. Jews oftentimes who are buried outside the land of Israel are buried with a little bit of dirt symbolic from the land of Israel, so that they can get a sense of what the land is like before the final judgment. Here, representatives, in a sense, representing the fulfillment of Herzl's Zionist vision of creating a state, brought all of those, bought sacks, I should say, from all of their communities all over Israel. So it's quite an interesting moment where Herzl is placed there. This is what it looks like originally. And if you've been to Mount Herzl, you might notice today, there's a lot more construction all around it. The city pretty much grew around the mountain on the western edge. This is the way the tomb looks today. And in recent years, amazingly, I don't think the current president, and I'm not sure if President Biden did either, But President Obama, you can see on the right-hand side, made a trip, one of his last trips, if not his last, to Israel. There you can see to the tomb of Theodor Herzl. Behind him at the time was President Shimon Peres, and on the left was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the time. And it's amazing because the president didn't want to go to the old city because of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, but was prepared to go to Mount Herzl. And in my eyes, that was an incredible statement on the behalf of the American government and the American people, because it suggests, as we know, but it gives that kind of stamp of approval that we are a reborn, we are a sovereign in our ancient homeland. By paying homage to the founder of the political movement that said that we are not a race, but we are a people that is connected to a particular piece of land and connected to a particular story and connected to God, and all of this is all connected, this is our capital. And to do that here in the city of Jerusalem, to me, was a very, very powerful statement, which began to show a sign in the change of the protocol of the foreign ministry. I don't know how many other visitors have come and laid a wreath there, but to me, that was a very important watershed event. Who's buried next to Theodor Herzl? People you might not have heard of: Eliezer Kaplan, the first finance minister. Here's the map. You can see speakers, the Knesset over here, prime ministers over here, presidents over here. The tombs are all, at the beginning at least, were all identical. A simple black basalt stone with their name in Hebrew on it. In recent years, this is the tomb of Golda Meir. If you can see a little bit in Hebrew over here. The original Golda Meir in Hebrew, that was it. And in recent years, they've added a little bit more personality, a little bit more about who the individual was. Part of the idea of the founding fathers and mothers in creating the sacred space was to suggest a uniformity. Didn't matter who you were, your tomb was the same. You'll see the same in the military cemetery. All tombs are identical in the first 60 or 65 years of Israeli history. In the past 15 to 20 years, that's begun to change, as you'll see in just a moment. Levi Eshkol, remember, he was the finance minister who said the connection in space and in more than just space between Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, and Mount Herzl is very important. Our prime minister in 67, the tomb of Yitzhak Rabin and Leah Rabin. I said they're all identical, except for this one. Why? The tomb of Rabin is different because, unlike all the other presidents or prime ministers or speakers who died of disease or old age or whatever happened to them, he was murdered. And the idea, if you're creating a space that's going to tell a story for future generations, not just for those who remember where they were in that horrible November night of 1994 when he was murdered, but you want people to ask the question is, why is this tomb different than all of the others, right? Why is this night different? This is cue for next week. Why is this night different than all of the others? What's interesting to me, and the most significant watershed, was the tomb of Shimon Peres. Now, Shimon Peres did a lot of things in Israeli society. Shimon Peres was president in his last role, but he was prime minister and many other ministers. But what's interesting is on the three sides of his tomb, there is his name in Hebrew with the Hebrew date. There is a quote from David Ben-Gurion, right? A statesman, a lover of books, of poetry and art, a Nobel Peace Laureate, and a vision and a pragmatist. Sorry, he's got three different quotes, a lot of text about his life. And there is a quote in Hebrew from David Ben-Gurion, which essentially says that the Mutar Ruchanit, the spiritual image of the state of Israel, will be based on its internal strength, and in the future will be a key factor in the security and the international position of Israel. Why is Ben-Gurion quoted on the tomb of Shimon Peres? Because his first major job in public service for Shimon Peres was working with the Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. And then, besides the quote from his family, the first one I read, a statesman, a lover of book, besides a quote from his political mentor, David Ben-Gurion, is a quote from the Bible. And it's, of course, that quote from Isaiah, Lo yisa goy el goy cherev, v'chitetucha votam, right? Nation shall not fire a sword against nation anymore. They will turn their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks, and nation shall not raise sword again anymore, nor will they learn war anymore. That famous quote from chapter 2 of Isaiah. Why? Because Shimon Peres, lover of peace, most of the later years of his life, the last 25 years professional of his life, was dedicated to creating peace in the Middle East, even though his first major job was creating the defense ministry and potentially being the architect of the Israeli nuclear program. So the latest great leader, president or prime minister, who is buried in the cemetery, has a lot more of his personality, what he aspired to, where he came from, how his family looked at him, totally different than Golda Meir, who just has her name and her date of birth and her date of death on them. And to me, That marks a transition of how we tell the story. Yes, we are a nation. Yes, we are a people, but the individuality of the people in the nation is much more important than it was, or is recognized as much more important than it was a generation or two ago. As you leave the crest of the hill, so you start at the top of Mount Herzl, and then you walk in the parallel level to the Tomb of the Great Leaders, you start to descend the hill toward the military cemetery, and the first section that you see is this. It's shaped kind of like a parachute. There are 7 tombs or memorial stones. The one over here, you might not be able to see the Hebrew, but you see the parachute. That is Chana Senesh. You might not know of Chana Senesh, but she was arguably one of the most famous Israelis who fought with the British or trained with the British in order to go into Nazi-occupied Europe. She eventually was captured. Her job was to try to warn the leadership of the Hungarian Jewish community of what was happening, captured, tortured, and buried in Budapest. But again, after Israeli independence, she was exhumed and reinterred in the military cemetery. What's fascinating about her tomb is it gives you her biography, her name, daughter of, describes what happened, and then you'll see on the right there is a sword, and next to the sword, around the sword, is an olive branch. That is not quite the symbol of the IDF, because she died before there was an Israel, and before there was a D, and before there was an F. She was part of an organization called the Haganah. And so eventually, once Israel is born, her and people like Enzo Sereni and people like Chaviva Reich are all brought in to tell the story of one choice that part of the Jews who lived in the land of Israel before 1948 made. And that was led and inspired by the main leader, David Ben-Gurion, to volunteer with and train with the British and the Allies to fight against the Nazis, while at the same time to bring in Jewish immigrants illegally into the land of Israel. And so we're telling a story, the visionary of Zionism, the leaders, political leaders elected by the people, and now the sacrifice of those people even before independence, and then transitioning into the military cemetery. By the huge number of graves, this is the section, or one of the sections, that is dedicated to the war in 1947 to 1949. What war was there in 47, Mike? 47, I know of the War of Independence, true. But many historians will look at the war as beginning in the fall of 1947. Once the UN votes to partition Palestine, there begins to be a civil war at the end of November, early December, between Jews and Arabs in mixed cities like Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, Jaffa or Haifa or Akko or Lod and Ramla, over roads between the major cities, over isolated Jewish communities. And by the end of the war, by the spring of 1949, there are 6,000 Israelis in the nascent Jewish state who have been killed in the war. That is 1% of the population. Numbers oftentimes help us understand things. It would be equivalent of 100,000 people dying, just to put in context, to being killed on October 7th versus 1,200. So just in terms of gargantuan proportions of the enormity of loss. About a third of those people died fighting in Jerusalem or around Jerusalem. Some of them didn't even have a home. Literally, there were new immigrants who got off a boat, given a gun, a couple of days of training, sent to fight in a place called Latrun, for example, and died. And so they couldn't be buried on the eastern edge of Jerusalem, where Jews have for thousands of years traditionally been buried, right? They died fulfilling the vision of Theodor Herzl. But as the traditional burial ground on the Mount of Olives was under Jordanian control, in what becomes Eastern Jerusalem or Jordanian occupied and annexed Jerusalem, we couldn't bury them there, so they were buried on the western edge of the city. And in many ways, I think that this cemetery begins to represent the challenge of and the transition of what I mentioned earlier, going from Rabbanut to Ribonut. Yes, we're no longer just going to be the objects of everybody else's history in Europe, and not just going to listen to the laws interpreted by the rabbis, but rather we, the people, are going to be sovereign. But there's a very heavy price that we're going to have to pay, and we continue to pay for that sovereignty in the land of Israel. If you look at the tombs, you'll notice there's a difference. Look at the tomb on the right-hand side now. You'll see that there is a Star of David around them. You'll get another tomb, just the video I want. You'll get another tomb in just a minute time. This is the one, I think. I'll see if this one works. Yes. If you look at the tombs, I'll stop in just a minute. All uniform. That little black box that you see is for a memorial candle, a yahrzeit candle, either to be lit on the actual day of the death of the person, oh, sorry, I want to stop there, of the death of the person on their yahrzeit, or on Memorial Day for fallen Israeli soldiers. More of that in part 2 of my session, I should say. But let me press the right button this time. And there you go. So you see the person's name, Avner Shai. You see he's the son of his parents' name. It says he was born in Tunisia. And then it says he made Aliyah in this year, 1950, whatever. And then it said he died fighting in Sinai in, I want to say, 1974, 1975. There is the symbol. It's hard to see because it's small, but it's the sword. We need to defend ourselves. That's the D in the Israel Defense Forces, Haganah. We have a olive branch. The idea of the defense is to ensure that we can live in peace, and surrounded by the Magen David, Star of David, their rank and their serial number, okay? So you can see 99, and then you continue on, and you'll notice a name you might recognize of Yonatan Netanyahu. He's a lieutenant colonel. He was the commander of the raid on the 4th of July, 1976 at Entebbe, older brother of our current prime minister. And there he is in uniformity right next to the other tombs of the other soldiers. There it says he's decorated. He was granted a Medal of Valor. Next to him is the former commander-in-chief in 1973's war, David Elazar, who became the fall guy after a government commission of inquiry after the war, Yom Kippur War. He died in his 50s. So the highest rank in the army, next to a lieutenant colonel, on the other side of a private. That is what the military cemetery is all about, uniformity, for most of the 77 years that has been a military cemetery. In recent years, because of changes in Israeli society, there have been additions. Some of you, I believe, were with me in Lithuania. I know the Schultzes are on here. I don't know if anybody else is. But we went to Lithuania. Some of you might have had the opportunity of going to Russia. But in Russia, they commemorate a war called the Great Patriotic War that took place between 1941 and 1945. We don't have that war. We have the Second World War, which is 1939 to 1945. But from their point of view, it's a war against Germany that only begins with Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941. And you'll see here, it's a bit hard, but it says 200,000. This is a memorial to 200,000 Jews who died serving their motherland, the Red Army, in those 5 years of war defending the Soviet Union. But there's nothing anywhere in the Soviet Union or Russia today or any of the republics that commemorates the Jewish sacrifice. But there are a million Israelis, more, probably 1.5 million by now, or descendants of those who fought in that war. And as part of their story, sacred space in Jerusalem, that was added. Or this there's a close-up of it on the right-hand side. Same memorial, you can see the number of 200,000. Or what about the Jews who died 1939 to 1945? What's that? This is the symbol of the Polish army, by the way. They're Jews who fought for the Polish army in 1939 to 1945. They were Jews who were members of the Polish government in exile in those years under Nazi occupation. It says, in memory of the Jewish soldiers fallen, right, in the service. They flew higher than eagles and they were stronger than lions, a quote from David's eulogy after the death of King Saul and his son Jonathan and his 2 siblings on Mount Gilboa. So it's part of our story as well, because there are people here who are descendants. What about the story of the victims of terror? Where do you tell their story? There are thousands, many more today post-October 7th. I think we're closing in on 5,000, if not more, people who have been killed as a result of terror acts. Where should a place with the name of every single victim of terror be? But in our capital. And where in our capital? On our sacred mountain of memory, Mount Herzl. And you can see these are names in the year 2000, the beginning of the Intifada. I haven't been in this section of the military cemetery since October 7th, but it's now going to have another well over 1,000 names of people who were killed because of the terror act of October 7th. What about the Jews from Ethiopia? There are about 130, maybe 150,000 Jews today who came in 2 operations in 1984, Operation Solomon, 1991, Operation Moses in 84, and Solomon in 91, who were brought here. I like to say we're the only Western country that went into the heart of Africa and brought our people home rather than into slavery. And as part of Mount Herzl today, the story is told of those thousands who fell walking from Ethiopia, from parts of Ethiopia up to Sudan, or from Sudan to get to Israel. And it's part of the national story that there's a Memorial Day as part of the calendar. There's a memorial ceremony, an official day as part of the calendar that is told on this site of Mount Herzl. Again, you make a circle. Theodor Herzl, great leaders of the nation. the people who volunteered with the British and the other allies in the Second World War, the military cemetery. You then come in the military cemetery dedicated to Jews who fought fighting for Poland and for Russia. And then on your way out, you see this memorial to the Jews from Ethiopia. Look at these two tombs from the past, from before the war. So we're talking probably from 2000, and it says over there 2008 in the O's, or the knots, as we say. And notice the difference in these tombs. They still have the same matzeva, the same tombstone with their name and their rank and their number. But you'll notice there's different languages. There's Armenian here. There is English. There may be Russian, Cyrillic, right? You've got quotes, not just decorations of valor. You've got different styles of flowers. You've still got the same basic tomb, and you've got the place for the Yortzeit candle. You've got symbols from the units of the soldiers who fell. And much more of the story of the individuals who fell is told here on Mount Herzl as a result of parents' appeal about almost 20 years ago now to the Supreme Court and saying, yes, they're all the same. They all died in service defending their homeland on the one hand. On the other hand, but I want some element of individuality to tell the story of my daughter. This woman, for example, Hila, was a woman who was chosen to be part of the group that parades around at the end of Memorial Day ceremony on Mount Herzl in front of the tomb of Theodor Herzl. And she was practicing in the week leading up to the Memorial Day. And the stands, the temporary, bleachers that had been erected, collapsed on her and killed her. She was in uniform and she's buried in the military cemetery. But they want to tell part of that story somehow about who she was. You can see there she is proudly holding the decoration and the flag that she had for the ceremony that unfortunately she never got to be a part of. More and more individualization of the tombs. All of this leading up, and I'm not even going to talk about October 7th today, but all of this leading up, the story on the left of Michael Levine, a lone soldier from Pike County, just outside of Philadelphia, who makes Aliyah, comes and serves in the Paratroop Brigade, is in America in the war in 2006, the Second Lebanese War breaks out, comes back to join his team, and is killed in August of 2006. And as his parents came to Israel, they were worried that there wouldn't be enough people because they didn't know him. He didn't have any family here to allow them to say Kaddish at the ceremony, at the funeral. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people came because Michael is a young man who realized that he was part of the Jewish people. And as part of the Jewish people, he felt a certain sense of responsibility to serve. And his method of serving was to come to Israel and serve in the military, and ultimately paid with thousands of others that very, very heavy price. And countless groups, particularly teen tours and Birthright, and people can identify. It's hard to identify with 25,000 soldiers who have been killed, but it's easier to identify with one individual story, then multiply that by thousands and thousands. The last addition, looking at my time, I think I have time to add to this, to the military cemetery, is this section, which was added in 2017, 2018. It is called the Memorial Tent or the Memorial Hall. And inside it, it's hard to see, but on the wall, it'll get close. This is not my video. This is video from the Ministry of Defense. This beautiful structure built brick by brick by brick. Each brick in there is a brick with a name on it and the name of the soldier, their birth date and the date of death and their Yortzeit. And on the date of their death, the Yortzeit candle is lit up. And the first time I walked through there, it happened to be just after Yom Kippur. So it was the second or the third day of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lights were lit up. I was just there 2 weeks ago, and I saw, you can see the names of the individual, and the date of birth, and the date of, not the date of birth, just the date of death. It doesn't say the date of birth, I apologize. And it's hard to see, but each of these are individual names. And the message, of course, is quite clear, that the sum of the individuals makes up the whole. So you figure out a way to tell the story of the collective through brick by brick, individual by individual, one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other. It's a very, very powerful piece. If you've been to Israel and you've been to Mount Herzl, first of all, you need to come post October 7th because it's tragic. There are hundreds of more tombs that are there. But this is, I think, the most powerful addition to the cemetery, allowing every single person's story to be told, and then there are places where you can scan the names and learn much more about them. So just a little bit of a taste of the Memorial Hall. On the other side of the hill, as I mentioned before, is the third component, I'm going to pass that, is the third component This is the last more visuals of this amazing piece of architecture. And here you can see, right, this was just up to, I guess this was when I last took the picture in 2021. Even in times of quiet, there were soldiers who were killed. And families will go on the yahrzeit almost every single day in the Hebrew calendar. It is the yahrzeit of at least one Israeli soldier, and they will have time to participate in the 11 a.m. ceremony where Kaddish is said, El Malei Rachamim prayers are said, and the names of all of the soldiers killed on that particular day is recited. Next door, component number one, Mount Herzl, Theodor Herzl, the great leaders of the nation. Component number two, the military cemetery. Component number three is Yad Vashem, created by law in 1953 to be a memorial space to the 6 million Jews who died a martyr's death at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators. Many, many more aims, but the last line is the most important. The name chosen in 1953 by law was called in Hebrew Yad Vashem, a monument and a name, from the Bible, where God tells the prophet Isaiah, I will give them in my house and within my walls a monument and a name, better than sons or daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will not perish. Why? Because 1/3 of the Jewish people were murdered. There are many Holocaust memorials all over the world. I'm actually going later this month with a group to Amsterdam, and there's a new Dutch Holocaust museum that just opened in March of 2024. Never been there. Why now? Why didn't it open years earlier? I have no idea. I'll find out. I'll get back to you if we have another session later on in the summer. But there are loads and loads of them. But Yad Vashem is the biggest and is the national one, created by law in 1953. It evolved over 50 years, and by 2005, the new Yad Vashem, still the same, it's still a museum, but a new museum was built with this aerial picture. This main kind of long arrow is the historic museum, which tells the story more from the perspective of the individuals who were murdered rather than from the perspective of the perpetrators. If the first museum, from its creation in 1953 and opening later on, with all the components dedicated to commemorating the names of the righteous and telling their stories, and to all sorts of other memorials to children, and we'll see some of those in a minute, the historic museum changed, not because the Shoah changed, but because how we tell the story of the Shoah changed. In 1995, when the leaders of Yad Vashem decided to redo the museum, they said, we can't continue to tell the story through the perspective of the perpetrators. We need to tell the story through the perspective of the victims. And that's exactly what this new Yad Vashem does. There is the museum, beautiful design by Moshe Safdie, well-known Israeli-born but Boston-based architect, beginning over here, ending cantilevering out onto the western edge of the city. But before one actually enters the building, there are a number of memorials, including a boulevard. Now there's not enough room for it, but a section dedicated to the righteous amongst the nations, those upstanders who refuse to be bystanders, over 27,000 today, who risked their lives to save, if only one Jewish person, from the famous Oskar Schindler, of course, to the less famous, but bizarrely even more heroic in my eyes, women who organized to smuggle Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. Irina Sendler is perhaps the most famous of them. 2,500 children who were in her team smuggled outside of the Warsaw Ghetto. The memorial, the first memorial, you might remember if you were there years ago on the right-hand side, is a memorial. It's called the Memorial Tent, Ohel Yizkor, where groups will come and say Kaddish with eternal flame, and in front of the eternal flame, underneath that big slab of stone, are ash taken of victims of the Shoah brought here in the early years of Israel. Heads of state, the Pope, and others have come and had their ceremony here in Yad Vashem. The Children's Memorial was an addition added in 1987, designed by Moshe Safdie, the same Moshe Safdie who designed the whole new museum. And the idea of a museum, of a memorial for children, was something that they thought about for a long time, because 1 out of every 4 victims of the Shoah, 1.5 million people who were killed, were children. And the question that I always ask is, where would humanity be had all those children not have been murdered? First, we'd have a lot more children in the world, Jewish children. Second, maybe we'd be standing here with a cure to AIDS or a cure to cancer. And I always tell that story because you can see these stones at different heights, symbolizing the different ages of development of the children before they were murdered. It's as if a building is about to be built but isn't fully built. And I tell that story about maybe having a cure to AIDS, and then we had something called COVID. You might have remembered that a few years ago. And if it wasn't for COVID, you wouldn't be having 881 Zoom presentations, including this one tonight, because who ever heard of Zoom before March of 2020? But the guy who led the company that came up with the vaccine, Pfizer, was a guy, Dr. Borda, whose parents were Holocaust survivors in the city of Saloniki. So I don't say that facetiously anymore, that maybe had 1.5 million Jewish children not have been murdered, we might be sitting here with a cure to cancer or a cure to AIDS or any other disease. Another memorial, as you leave the Children's Memorial, is a memorial to Janusz Korczak, perhaps the most famous of the Polish Jews. There he is, holding his children. He went with them, even though he was given an opportunity by the Polish underground to escape the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942. He went with his children to the Umschlagplatz, boarded the train, and then he and all of the children were murdered in Treblinka. But we're fortunate that we have his writings. We have his educational theorem. If you study early childhood education, you want to go and learn about early childhood development, Piaget will come up under Google. So too will Dr. Janusz Korczak, preeminent Polish Jewish educator and physician. The Valley of the Communities, an area added in the 1990s, massive structure, kind of eked out of the earth with stones symbolic or reminiscent maybe of the Western Wall in the old city, without any plaster connecting them, with names of communities. There's Warszawa in Hebrew and in Polish and in English. And at the beginning in 1992, when this opened, it used to say in Hebrew, Bikat Takilot Avudot, the Valley of the Lost Communities. And you'll notice here it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work in English too. Valley of the Communities. It would make sense. The font should have been smaller. They could have put it, right? It wasn't centered because they etched out the lost in Hebrew and English. Why? Because people protested. What do you mean the valleys of the lost communities? Mike just said he's going to Amsterdam. There are Jews in Amsterdam today. You've been to Berlin. Some of you with me have been to Berlin. You've been to Vilnius. You've been to Warsaw, right? Jews live in Europe. How can we say lost communities? Some of them were totally destroyed, but they took those communities with them wherever they went, one, and two, there's still Jews living there. So again, you want to create a sense of enormity of loss by creating a valley not with names of individuals, but names of communities from where people were taken and murdered, and reflect on the enormity of loss. A train car. You might have been in the train car in Washington Museum, the Holocaust Museum, and the Smithsonian. I think the Dallas Museum has one. The Chicago or the Illinois Holocaust Museum has one as well. But the train car in Yad Vashem is placed differently. You can't enter it. You can just see it afar, going off into the distance, about to fall over the precipice. And as you walk down there, you pass through the garden of the righteous amongst the nations. There's no more room left in Yad Vashem to actually have trees, as they started, for each of the 27,000 of the righteous amongst the nations. Some of the images are from inside the museum. It's a very, again, if you've been to Israel, haven't been in a long time, go to Yad Vashem. The bad news is you have to make a reservation even if you just want to walk in, but you need to make a reservation. And it's a very powerful attempt, I believe, and successful, to try to tell a story. It's not just the story of the murder of 6 million Jews, but it's the story of who those people were in life before they became victims. And the last room in the museum, there you can see I've highlighted in red in Hebrew and in English to quote, V'natati lachem, and I gave them in my home a place and a name, right? Yad Vashem. And the last room is this Hall of Names. And in the Hall of Names, there are files of over almost 4.5 million now, names of the 6 million victims of the Shoah. And there's 600 images above of individuals, men and women, young and old, rich and poor, God-fearing, ultra-Orthodox, God-hating Marxists, Jews like us, who, because of when and where they lived, were given a death sentence and were murdered. And it allows us to reflect, again, through the individual stories about the enormity of loss. Well, how can I understand that, Mike? There's 600 images. You'd need, to put it in context, 10,000 rooms, each of which with 600 images in order to give us a full 6 million images. That's not going to happen in any space. So before I turn it over, as I look, I've got 9 minutes left, right, Gila, at the questions. 2 more images. And that is, what do we do with all of this? It's a good question. The rabbis reflected on this very question once the temple was destroyed. When it was destroyed a second time, there was a big question of what to do. There were some people who said, look, We can't drink wine anymore because we can't offer any more libations for wine. We can't eat meat anymore because we can't offer any more libations. There's no place to sacrifice. There's no temple anymore. We can't eat bread. What are we going to do? And the rabbis, don't read the first paragraph, said the following. If so, we will not eat bread since the meal offerings were offered upon, so we can't do anything. What do we do? Rabbi Yeshua said to them, my children, come and I will tell you how we should act. To not mourn at all is impossible, as the decree was already issued and the temple has been destroyed. But to mourn excessively as you are doing is impossible, as the sages do not issue a decree upon the public unless the majority of the public is able to abide by it. We can't not eat bread, not drink wine, not eat meat, we not eat any of the first fruits, not eat any of the grains. We will not survive. And so we've dealt with that question for thousands and thousands of years. How do we remember and continue to live? And as I said, today I've talked, because nobody else has said anything yet, that's my fault, but I've talked about how we tell a story, how the story we tell and how we tell the story has evolved over time in that particular place, in that ancient and modern capital of our people, Jerusalem. And next week I'll talk about time. But before that, I want to share one poem from my favorite Israeli poet, Yehuda Amichai, who talks about the very place that you just visited virtually with me. And that is Memorial Hill. There it is in Hebrew, and here it is in English. Let the Memorial Hill remember instead of me. That's what it's here for. Let the park in memory of remember. Let the street that's named for remember. Let the well-known building remember. Let the synagogue that's named after God remember. Let the rolling Torah scroll remember. Let the prayer for the memory of the dead remember. Let the flags remember, those multicolored shrouds of history. The bodies they wrapped have long since turned to dust. Let the dust remember. Let the dung remember at the gate. Let the afterbirth remember. Let the beasts of the field and the birds of the heavens eat and remember. Let all of them remember so that I can rest. And with that, I come to the point where I turn it over to you. Those of you who have any questions, through Gila.
Thank you so much. That was super enlightening. And we do have a few questions, if you don't mind. So, in the greats of the nation, there are some people who are not buried there. Could you tell us what that says about memory and commemoration about them?
It's a great question. Well, Theodor Herzl, you remember, is the first person who wanted to be buried there. I mean, he was buried there. I mean, he got there 45 years too late. But not every single person is part of this pantheon. It's kind of like, how do I describe it? I don't know if every American, maybe not American, forget the American example, but there are few Israeli leaders who chose, while they were alive, not to be buried there. The first, of course, was our founding prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, who wanted to be buried in the Negev. His idea from 1953, the last 20 years of his life, was to spend his life there because, as in case you didn't know this, you will be reminded next week, and the reason that Gila and I are speaking to you in Israel and you're outside of Israel is because we moved to Israel because we have only one Seder, but you'll tell the story twice. And when you tell the story twice, it's how we were formed as a people in the desert. And Ben-Gurion said, we were formed as a people here, that's where I want to be. Inspired by a group of young men and women who founded Kibbutz Sde Boker, he joined them and he lays eternally with his wife Paula, overlooking the wilderness of Tzin, the area where we wandered through 40 years in the desert. Fast forward a few decades, 2.5 actually, to the late 1980s, where Menachem Begin, early 90s I think, where Menachem Begin, prime minister, the first prime minister elected in 1977 of the political right, everyone afterwards, it was before him, I should say, was Ben-Gurion and Levi Eshkol and Moshe Sharett, and Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir and Rabin and Peres. All of them were of the left Labor, or different versions of the Labor Party. And Begin, I think, said the following: A, I don't agree with these guys in life. Why would I want to lie next to them in eternity? And B, I, as a traditional Jew, not Orthodox, but more traditional, wanted to be buried in the traditional burial site of the Mount of Olives. Now, when pre-67, you couldn't do that because that was still in Jordan. Begin died later, although Ben-Gurion could have been buried there, but he didn't want to. And the third reason Begin said is that there are two members of his underground organization who were killed, or took their lives actually. He wanted to be buried next to them in a very simple grave that just said his name, didn't say prime minister, wasn't part of this great pantheon. The great, and I think, to me, the insightfulness, if that's a word, the insight, that's the word, the insight of the amazing leadership of both Ben Gurion of the center left and Begin of the center right. Simple people who dedicated their lives to the people and wanted to be buried in areas that symbolized something very significant to them as individuals about our story, whether it was where we were formed. The atheist Ben Gurion, keep in mind, Ben Gurion, the atheist, wanted to be buried next to the wilderness of Tzin, where the Bible tells us we wandered. And Ben Gurion and Begin, who wanted to be buried in the Mount of Olives as a more traditional Jew, buried with members of his revisionist underground who took their lives rather than be killed by the British. So it says a lot about that leadership and their individuality and their desire to suppress the greatness of their personalities vis-a-vis the sacred space of Mount Herzl. I never thought about it until I actually answered this question. There's another one, Moshe Sharet is buried in Tel Aviv, but the majority are buried in Jerusalem. And I think it says a lot about their individual characters. It'll be interesting to see what happens when there are other prime ministers, of course, who aren't buried there, because they're still alive. From Ehud Barak to Ehud Olmert to, you name it. But there are a few others who...
Also, Ariel Sharon.
And Ariel Sharon, thank you. Sharon, fantastic. Thank you for reminding me, Gila. Sharon is buried on the little farm that he has just outside of the town of Sderot in the Western Negev, not too far from Gaza, because he saw himself as being part of the land and being, he grew up in a moshav, Kfar Malal, and he very much identified with the land. And he too, for I think a couple of reasons, didn't see himself as part of the pantheon up on Mount Herzl, and also wanted to, strengthen his idea of being connected directly to the land and part of his farm. The truth is also his first wife, who happened to be the sister of his second wife, that's another story, was buried. She died young in a car crash. She was buried across the farm, and I think he very much wanted to join her for eternity.
Okay, because there are other military cemeteries around the country, who decides who is buried on Mount Herzl and who is buried in a military cemetery that's not Mount Herzl?
Great question. Well, there are dozens and dozens of military cemeteries, and even the town that I live in, of Modi'in, right between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's a new town. It's only not even 25 years old. I unfortunately went to a funeral there a couple months ago of an acquaintance of ours, died too young. But on my way out, I stopped by the military section. So you walk into the main cemetery, and there are thousands of graves. And then on the side is a separate section, which is maintained by the Ministry of Defense for people who fall in service. It could be they're killed in a car accident on the way home from their base. One of my kids' classmates from the school, that happened to him, Nadav Ezra. But I counted 27 graves of soldiers who died on October 7th and since October 7th from my little town of Modi'in, which is, I think, the city with the highest percentage of people who were killed in the war on October 7th and since October 7th. And every major city and even every little kibbutz has a small little military section that is paid for and maintained by the Ministry of Defense rather than the National Insurance Institute, which maintains the regular burial plots. So you're buried in the city that you are a resident of or you were born in. It happened a few times. I know that particularly in Modi'in, that there are people from Modi'in who were born in Modi'in, but wanted to be buried, or were raised in Modi'in, but were born in Jerusalem, wanted to be buried in Jerusalem. But generally, it's the family that decides where they're going to be buried, and they're generally buried in the towns that they live in.
Thank you. Well, just one more question. You mentioned in the beginning about from Shoah to Tecuma, and it's interesting you did Yad Vashem after the cemetery. What is the connection, the physical connection between the two?
Well, I did it because I went chronologically. So I probably should have begun with the military cemetery because people were buried there before Herzl was buried there, but chronologically it becomes this kind of national epicenter of sacred space with Herzl, and then the military cemetery. And only in 1953, 4 years after Herzl was brought there, does Yad Vashem actually created. They're contiguous. I mean, you literally can park your car opposite the tomb of Herzl, walk in a couple hundred yards to Herzl, make a circle, and then come up to the top of the hill. And then from the tomb of the great leaders, or you can even choose to go from the tomb of Herzl and the prime ministers and presidents down to Yad Vashem. There's a path that opened barely a decade ago that now connects them. And you'll oftentimes, if you go on a Sunday, you'll probably be one of the few peoples not in uniform. If you're coming with Ari and CSP, you'll all be wearing your CSP hat, at least the Schultzes will. But everybody else, almost, on a Sunday morning will be in military uniform, because part of the service in the IDF is to socialize and educate young Israelis who come from different backgrounds, veteran Israelis, new immigrants, different languages, different cultures, different faith traditions. And so as part of what they do in their basic training is they'll spend a day on this mountain of memory, Har HaZikaron. They'll start with Yad Vashem, they'll break for lunch, and then they'll make the circle and do the military cemetery, the tomb of Theodor Herzl. So I always tell people, if you come to Israel, you can't just spend one day in Jerusalem and understand why we're here. Yes, you need to understand the old city and the temples and the story of the binding of Isaac and David and Solomon and Herod and everything else, and the Christian story and the Muslim Islamic story. That's all in and around the old city. But you need to go to the Western Edge to understand the contemporary, really the past 150 years of the Jewish story, of the renaissance of, or the birth, not renaissance, but the birth of Jewish nationalism, Zionism, the visionary, the leaders, the price we pay for that, military cemetery, and the price we pay for not having had sovereignty in our land, the Shoah on the other side of the hill. So it's all this continuum, and it's all this, as I said, this sacred space formed really in that first decade of Israeli independence.
Thank you so much for this. It's been super interesting. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody for joining in. Looking forward, I think Ari is hosting on Thursday and Cheryl's hosting on Tuesday. On Tuesday, as I said, it's Rabbi Chaim Siedler Fellow, Back to the Future of the Beginning of Zionism. And on Thursday, our special Pesach program with the book launch. So we look forward to seeing you all then, but I won't see you again before Pesach. So I'd like to wish everybody a Chag Sameach. It's really nice having you all here in this community, and I hope that you have lovely Seders with lots of questions, because we're all here to learn together. So thank you so much to everybody. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Gila. One last word. First of all, hi, Jeff. I see you and Mary too on the screen. And that is that, as Joseph Chaim Yerushalmi said, as I said at the beginning, what we do in our faith, in our story, in our tradition, is that we reactualize memory. And that's what we're going to be doing around the Pesach Seder. So I encourage you not just to do what you typically do, but think out of the box, raise deep questions about the challenges of how we integrate what happened on October 7th and continues to happen in our story. Because remember, there's still, and I'm wearing this, there's still 59 hostages who are enduring much worse than slavery in the dungeons of Hamas, not too far away from where Gila and I are sitting. So may they come home quickly. May you celebrate the Pesach together with your family, and I look forward to seeing you on the 17th of April.